Hello and welcome to our podcast of Group 1. I am Caden.
And I'm Anirudh.
And we're the hosts of the podcast today. The podcast today topic is Galesburg Path to Freedom, with the focus on the abolition in Galesburg, Illinois. The city has a rich history intertwined with the fight for justice and equality. Joining us is Professor Cate Denial, Mary Elizabeth Henbright, and Edwin Winslow Bright, Distinguished Professor of American History, Director of the Bright Institute at Knox College. We're so thankful for your being here, Professor Cate Denial.
Thank you for inviting me.
Without further ado, let's get to the podcast with us. Starting off with the first question. Many people today might not fully understand what abolition means in a contemporary context. How do you define abolition, and what does it encompass beyond just slavery?
So abolition is a concept that is rooted in getting rid of slavery in the 19th century. Abolition was that there should be no slavery at all, right? But abolition continued after the Civil War and after the constitutional amendments that made slavery impossible unless it was for punishment as a crime. And abolition in the 20th century, and particularly in the contemporary time, has meant a couple of different things. There's abolition in terms of the prison industrial complex and changing the justice system to one that is actually just. And then there's abolition in terms of education too.
The Underground Railroad plays a huge part in Galesburg abolition. Can you tell us more?
Sure. So the Underground Railroad was a network of individuals, families, places that could range from actual buildings, people's homes, their farms, to just safe places to hide, okay? And they were staffed, although that makes it sound like somebody was getting paid for doing this. None of this was paid, right? This was all illegal, and this was all just motivated by people who believed slavery was wrong. Yeah. Some of those people were formerly enslaved themselves. Some of them were white, some of them were black, some of them were native, right? There's lots of different people involved. And what would happen is that you would have directions, or you would have a guide who would tell you how to get to the next place. So nobody ever knew all the stops on the Underground Railroad, right? Because that would put the whole thing in jeopardy. So you would learn where you were headed to next, and then once you got there, you would learn where you were going after that, right? And if somebody else followed you 2 weeks later, they might get sent in a very different direction. It was a vast network, right? Yes. And the secrecy was super important, so that, because of course enslavers and the people they employed to catch formerly enslaved people, they wanted this thing gone, right? This was a threat to their entire way of living.
Yes.
So it had to be kept secret, except under the most pressing circumstances of actually trying to escape.
Oh, wow. So it's like a big role, railroad played a very big role in the abolition.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Great. What challenges did abolitionists face in Galesburg?
In Galesburg, it's less that abolitionists face challenges in Galesburg, it's that they face challenges around Galesburg, right?
Yes.
So, like I said, Knoxville was quite pro-slavery, the majority of people who lived there.
Yeah.
And so there are instances where enslaved people get to Galesburg on the Underground Railroad, and slave catchers catch up with them. They're taken to Knoxville's jail to be held. And there is an instance, again, you're going to have to look up this person's name, but I believe the formerly enslaved woman's name was Suki, and she was taken to jail and people from Galesburg went and broke her out of jail in Knoxville. And she was brought back to Galesburg. She had children. Those children were taken back to slavery by the slave catcher, right?
Oh.
But she stayed in Galesburg for the rest of her life.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some remarkable things that happened in this place. And, you know, Knoxville's not very far away. It's like 15 minutes in the car. So obviously it took a lot longer to get there back in 1850 something, right? But it's very, very close.
Yes.
So there was no uniform sentiment about slavery or abolition in Illinois, for example. So different towns had different personalities and different beliefs, and the people in them did and thought different things.
What parallels do you see between the historical abolition movement and the contemporary movement for social justice nowadays, such as Black Lives Matter, for example?
Well, the two things are deeply connected because you had enslavement in the United States from the earliest years of the 17th century, even before that, if we include the parts of what's now the United States that were controlled for a while by the Spanish, right? So even earlier than that, all the way up to 1865, right? And accompanying slavery are stereotypes and lies about African-American people, whether they are enslaved or not, right? Even if you're a free African-American person, the discrimination and prejudice that you faced in the United States was enormous. That doesn't evaporate in 1865, right? Just because slavery has been abolished does not suddenly mean that everybody is equal.
Oh, right.
Right?
Yeah.
And what follows slavery is a very brief period where there's something called radical reconstruction, where for a time, people in the South especially experimented with radically different ways of doing politics and government. And lots of Black men in particular got elected to the State House and got elected to Congress, right?
Yes.
But the people at the top of the heap, especially the presidents, weren't the president after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated was Andrew Johnson, and he was very, very sympathetic to formerly enslaved. No, he was very, very sympathetic to enslavers, right? And so he undercuts everything that radical reconstruction was trying to achieve. And when the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, when that rose up as a form of resistance against Black power, that was when he did not do anything about it, right?
Okay.
So you end up with Reconstruction shifting into the system of Jim Crow. And Jim Crow is a system that holds that all Black people are inferior. They are all, lots and lots of stereotypes about who Black people are, what they are capable of, and a system that ensures that they find it tremendously difficult, even impossible, to get into positions of power where they can change that system. It's accompanied by enormous violence. So there's lynching that happens all the way through the end of the 19th and into the 20th century, right? So if you step out of line at all in the eyes of white society, one of the things is a mob is going to come to your house, very likely, and they're going to hurt you or even kill you.
So when we came to Knox, as an international students, we didn't know the history of abolition in Galesburg.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure a lot of people are not aware of this history. So what do you think, what kind of actions should be taken so that students and people here are aware of this history?
Yeah, right.
So there's a couple of great resources on campus already. Okay. The exhibition that's on the first floor of Old Main is about the history mostly of the college and some history of that building in particular, right? So if you look at that exhibition, that has quite a bit to do with what's happening in terms of abolition. And then on the third floor of Alumni Hall, there's a museum exhibit that's on each side of Alumni Hall. And that is trying to sort of put the history of abolitionism in context. So it has some really specific stuff about Galesburg, but it also tells you the story of what was happening in Illinois, what was happening in the United States as a whole in this period, right? You learn something about expansion into the West, the dispossession of Native people, all the things that sort of bubbled up to make it possible for a bunch of white people from New York to make this town and be involved in abolition here. So
I suppose that is all of our question that we want to ask you today.
Okay.
Do you have anything more about you to share about this topic that we haven't covered in our question?
No, I think you were very thorough. You've given me a really good workout today. So thank you for inviting me. This is wonderful.
So once again, we want to say thank you, Professor Cate Denial, for sharing your insights and your expertise on abolitionist movement in Galesburg. It is inspiring to see how the legacy of those who fought for the justice continue to resonate in our community. You want to say something?
Yeah. So our listeners, I urge you all to actively seek out local resources, participate in community events, and establish connections with organizations that are devoted to advancing social justice. Recognizing and understanding our history is a critical step in laying the foundation for a more equitable future. Thank you for joining us to the Galesburg Path to Freedom. If you found this episode insightful, please share it with others. Yeah. Once again, thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. We are your hosts of this podcast, Khanh Nguyen and Anirudh Madarapu. Our editor for this podcast is Conversi. Joining us, we have Professor Cate Denial. We derived our music from Transistor.